In commercial aviation, landing that first international customer can change absolutely everything for a new aircraft program. And right now, the Chinese-built COMAC C919 may be closer than it has ever been to crossing exactly that line. Recent reports suggest a major Southeast Asian airline is seriously weighing whether to fly the jet, a move that could potentially crack open a market that Boeing and Airbus have controlled for decades. If that actually happens, it could mark the opening chapter of an entirely new era in global aviation. But why would any airline take that kind of risk? And how might it ripple outward and affect Boeing's future? Let's break it all down properly. Before we get into it, if you enjoy deep aviation stories like this one, take a moment to like the video and subscribe for more analysis on the future of aircraft and airlines. To really understand why this potential airline decision carries so much weight, we first need to look closely at the aircraft sitting at the center of the entire story. The jet in question is the COMAC C919, a narrow-body airliner developed by China's state-backed aerospace manufacturer. For China, this aircraft represents one of the single most ambitious aviation projects the country has ever attempted. The underlying goal is simple to state, but extraordinarily difficult to actually pull off: compete head-to-head with two of the most successful aircraft families in the entire history of modern commercial aviation, the Boeing 737 MAX and the Airbus A320neo. Those two aircraft families completely dominate the global market for short and medium-haul flying. Airlines around the world rely on them constantly to carry passengers between major cities, regional destinations, and busy economic hubs. This is the single segment of aviation where the largest number of aircraft are sold and flown every single year, the true bread and butter of the entire industry. By stepping directly into this category, the C919 is walking straight into one of the most fiercely competitive and strategically important corners of the entire aerospace world. In terms of pure design, the aircraft sits squarely within the same class as its Western rivals. It's configured to carry somewhere between approximately 150 and 190 passengers, depending on exactly how a given airline chooses to lay out the cabin. That capacity range makes it well suited to precisely the kind of routes that form the backbone of everyday commercial aviation. Flights lasting just a few hours that connect large population centers with regional markets. In many ways, this is the true workhorse category of global aviation, the segment where reliability, fuel efficiency, and overall operating economics matter more than almost anything else, because airlines are moving millions upon millions of passengers through it every single year. But this jet isn't simply another aircraft entering an already crowded marketplace. For China, it represents something considerably bigger than that. For decades, the entire commercial aviation industry has been dominated overwhelmingly by Western manufacturers. Aircraft built by companies like Boeing and Airbus became the default, standard choice for airlines everywhere on the planet, with very few genuine alternatives ever emerging to challenge that arrangement. Developing a truly competitive aircraft of its own gives China the opportunity to build out a genuine domestic aerospace ecosystem, one that could eventually support its own airlines while also, in time, attracting international customers of its own. And in many meaningful ways, the launch of the C919 has already been a genuine milestone in its own right. The aircraft has successfully entered commercial service and is now flying regular routes within China. That alone represents a significant achievement for a relatively young aircraft program, one that had to overcome enormous technical, regulatory, and industrial hurdles just to reach this point. Passengers are actively flying on the aircraft today. Airlines are steadily integrating it into their existing fleets, and the program continues to gradually expand its footprint inside the country's fast-growing domestic aviation market. However, there remains one major challenge still standing squarely between this aircraft and true global success. Despite all the attention the program has received, nearly all of its actual flight operations to date remain confined entirely within China's own borders. Outside the country, airlines have been notably cautious, hesitant to commit to an aircraft program with so little operational history outside its home market. In the aviation industry, credibility very often comes down to a simple question: who actually operates a given aircraft, and where does it fly? When airlines around the world watch a new jet get successfully adopted and operated by international carriers, confidence in that program tends to grow rapidly and compound quickly. That's precisely why the next step for the C919 may end up being the single most important one it has faced yet. If this aircraft genuinely hopes to become a serious competitor on the global stage, it will eventually need something that every major aircraft program in history has depended on: its first genuine international customer. And that is exactly why recent reports about a Southeast Asian airline actively evaluating the jet have suddenly captured the attention of the entire aviation industry, virtually overnight. If you were sitting in an airline executive's chair right now, would you take a genuine risk on a relatively new, unproven aircraft program like the C919? Or would you play it safe and stick with a thoroughly proven jet like the 737 MAX? Let me know what you do in the comments below. Up until now, the C919 has operated almost exclusively inside China. That's exactly why this next step matters so enormously. According to recent industry reporting, one specific carrier in Southeast Asia is now seriously evaluating the possibility of actually operating this jet. And the airline sitting at the very center of that discussion is Malaysia Airlines. For the global aviation industry, this news immediately grabbed attention. For years now, the C919 program has remained almost entirely confined within China's domestic market. Chinese carriers have been the sole meaningful operators, and the aircraft's presence internationally has remained extremely limited, almost negligible. That's precisely why even the idea of a foreign airline seriously considering this jet represents such a significant moment in the program's overall development. What makes this particular situation especially interesting is exactly how the airline itself has chosen to describe its own evaluation process. In interviews, executives from Malaysia Airlines have gone out of their way to emphasize that they remain genuinely open to reviewing aircraft from any manufacturer at all. Their stated goal, as they've explained it publicly, isn't to favor one particular country or one particular aerospace company over another for political or symbolic reasons. Instead, the focus stays squarely on the fundamentals that matter most in commercial aviation, safety, operational reliability, and long-term commercial efficiency. For an airline operating in one of the most fiercely competitive regions on the planet, those practical factors often end up mattering far more than simple brand loyalty or historical habit. This kind of open, methodical approach is actually fairly common in serious airline fleet planning. When carriers consider adding new aircraft types to their existing fleets, they typically conduct long, detailed, multi-stage evaluations. Those assessments can cover everything from fuel efficiency figures and projected maintenance costs to pilot and technician training requirements and realistic delivery timelines. Airlines routinely compare multiple competing aircraft types side by side before ever committing to a final purchase decision. In many cases, this entire process can take years to work through before a formal purchase agreement is ever actually signed. But even at this relatively early evaluation stage, the implications of Malaysia Airlines seriously examining this aircraft are already genuinely significant. Malaysia Airlines happens to be one of the most recognizable, most established carriers across the entirety of Southeast Asia, operating an extensive network that connects major cities throughout Asia and well beyond the region. Aviation analysts and rival airlines across the region watch its fleet decisions extremely closely, treating them as a meaningful signal about where the broader market might be heading. If a carrier operating at this scale begins seriously considering a relatively new aircraft program, it naturally raises pointed questions across the entire industry. And that brings us directly to the key point that makes this whole story so genuinely compelling. If Malaysia Airlines were to actually move forward with a firm order, it wouldn't simply be another routine aircraft, purchased buried in an industry press release. It could make the airline one of the very first international operators of this aircraft anywhere outside mainland China. In aviation, that kind of milestone carries enormous weight. The first airline to adopt a new aircraft type in an unfamiliar market frequently becomes the proof point that every other carrier in the region watches closely before making its own decision. That's exactly why this evaluation has already sparked so much discussion among aviation observers and industry analysts around the world. For COMAC, successfully securing a genuine foreign airline customer would represent an enormous step toward achieving real global credibility, something the program has been chasing for years. And for Malaysia Airlines, this decision could potentially place the carrier squarely at the center of one of the most closely watched developments currently unfolding anywhere in the commercial aviation industry. If Malaysia Airlines really is seriously evaluating the COMAC C919, the next logical question practically asks itself, why Malaysia specifically, and why right now? The answer lies largely in the rapid transformation currently reshaping aviation across the whole of Southeast Asia. Over the past decade or so, air travel between China and the countries making up ASEAN has grown at a genuinely dramatic pace. Tourism, trade, and business travel have all surged simultaneously, turning this particular corridor into one of the fastest growing aviation markets found anywhere on the planet. For airlines based in the region, that kind of growth represents a massive opportunity, but only for carriers that actually have enough aircraft on hand to support it. Malaysia Airlines has been positioning itself right at the heart of this broader regional expansion. The airline has been steadily increasing its focus on routes connecting China with Southeast Asia, including existing services to Chengdu, while also actively exploring potential new routes, such as a possible connection to Shenzhen. The broader strategic goal here is to strengthen Kuala Lumpur's position as a genuine regional hub for passenger traffic flowing between China and the rest of the ASEAN bloc. In the airline industry, hub strategies matter enormously precisely because they let a carrier funnel passengers from many different origin points through a single central hub airport, creating far more efficient route networks and considerably higher overall passenger volumes as a result. However, building out that kind of ambitious network requires one absolutely essential resource above everything else: actual aircraft. Airlines simply cannot expand their route networks or increase flight frequency without enough planes physically sitting in their fleet. And right now, that particular constraint has become a genuine industry-wide challenge. The two dominant aircraft manufacturers, Boeing and Airbus, are both currently sitting on massive order backlogs. Popular in-demand jets like the Boeing 737 MAX and the Airbus A320neo are frequently sold out years in advance, meaning airlines placing new orders today often have to wait an extraordinarily long time before those aircraft actually get delivered. This is precisely where a relative newcomer like COMAC might genuinely hold a real advantage. According to airline executives familiar with the evaluation, one potential benefit of choosing the C919 could be meaningfully earlier delivery availability compared with what Western manufacturers are currently able to offer, in a market where airlines are actively racing to grow their capacity quickly. Getting hold of new aircraft sooner rather than later can be an extremely powerful incentive all on its own, sometimes powerful enough to offset understandable hesitation about a less proven aircraft program. That underlying reality helps explain exactly why Southeast Asia in general, and Malaysia specifically, has suddenly become such an important proving ground for this jet's future prospects. If the C919 genuinely enters revenue service with a legitimate international carrier, it could realistically trigger a meaningful ripple effect across the wider aviation industry. Airlines famously watch each other's fleet decisions extremely closely. When one carrier successfully operates a relatively new aircraft type without major issues, other carriers gradually begin viewing it as a genuinely proven low-risk option rather than an unnecessary gamble. This dynamic is exactly what makes a potential move by Malaysia Airlines so significant in the bigger picture. If the airline formally introduces the jet into its fleet and operates it effectively over time, it sends an extremely strong signal to the rest of the industry that this aircraft can genuinely perform well outside China's own domestic market. That kind of real-world validation can shift industry perception remarkably quickly, especially across regions where airlines are actively hunting for additional capacity right now, and those particular regions genuinely matter a great deal here. Markets across Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and other rapidly developing parts of the world are all expanding quickly, driven by rising demand for exactly the kind of short and medium-haul flying this aircraft category is built for. These also happen to be precisely the same markets where the Boeing 737 MAX and the Airbus A320neo currently hold overwhelming dominance. For decades now, those two aircraft families have essentially defined the entire global narrow-body segment, with barely any serious alternative ever managing to gain real traction. One single international customer certainly won't immediately dismantle that kind of entrenched dominance overnight. Boeing and Airbus still maintain absolutely massive global support ecosystems, thousands upon thousands of aircraft already in active service worldwide, and deep, long-standing relationships with airlines across virtually every region on Earth. But that isn't really where the true significance of this story actually lies. In fast-growing markets like Southeast Asia and the Middle East, airlines are actively, urgently searching for additional capacity right now, today, not years down the road. If this aircraft manages to enter those markets, even at a fairly modest initial scale, it could still realistically mark the very beginning of a much larger, longer-term shift in how the global narrow-body market is structured. There's also a symbolism worth acknowledging here that goes beyond pure commercial logic. Malaysia has historically maintained a genuinely balanced, carefully managed relationship with both Washington and Beijing, avoiding the kind of tight alignment with either side that some of its regional neighbors have leaned into over the years. An aircraft purchase decision of this scale inevitably carries at least some geopolitical weight, whether an airline's executives want it to or not, simply because it involves choosing between an American and European industrial powerhouse on one side and a rising Chinese state-backed manufacturer on the other. Malaysia Airlines has been careful in its public messaging to frame this purely as a commercial evaluation rather than a geopolitical statement, but industry observers across the region will inevitably read some strategic significance into whatever decision eventually gets made, regardless of how the airline itself chooses to characterize it. It's worth pausing here to think about exactly what's driving Boeing and Airbus's current backlog problem in the first place, because it isn't simply a temporary blip. Both companies have spent years wrestling with supply chain disruptions, engine delivery delays from their own suppliers, and lingering production challenges that trace back to disruptions during the pandemic years. Layer on top of that a genuinely enormous surge in overall global travel demand, and you end up with order books stretching out well into the next decade for some of the most popular aircraft variants. For an airline that needs capacity urgently to capture growth happening right now, rather than growth that might materialize 5 or 6 years from now, that kind of extended waiting period represents a very real, very tangible cost, not just an abstract inconvenience. It's also worth thinking about what a successful Malaysia Airlines order would mean specifically for pilots and cabin crew, the people who would actually have to live with this decision every single working day. Introducing a genuinely new aircraft type into an existing fleet isn't just a matter of signing a purchase agreement and waiting for delivery. It requires standing up an entirely new training program from the ground up, securing type rating courses for pilots who may have spent their entire careers flying Boeing or Airbus aircraft, building out simulator access, and developing new maintenance procedures and spare parts logistics essentially from scratch. Airlines that have gone through this exact process with other new aircraft types in the past will tell you it's rarely simple or quick, and it represents a real, ongoing operational cost that has to be weighed carefully against whatever advantages an aircraft offers on paper, whether that's earlier delivery slots, a lower purchase price, or improved fuel efficiency. It's also worth considering what this evaluation means from Beijing's broader strategic perspective, not just from Malaysia Airlines' own commercial calculus. China has spent years and poured enormous state resources into building the C919 program specifically because it wants a credible domestic alternative to Western aircraft, one capable eventually of competing well beyond its own borders. Every single domestic delivery inside China represents real progress toward that goal, but it's fundamentally a different kind of achievement than winning over a genuinely independent, commercially minded foreign carrier operating in a highly competitive open market. Malaysia Airlines doesn't have any particular political obligation to choose a Chinese aircraft. If it does move forward, that decision will have been made almost entirely on commercial and operational grounds, precisely the kind of validation that carries far more weight internationally than another domestic Chinese order ever could. There's also a fleet diversification argument that airline strategists sometimes raise in situations exactly like this one, even setting aside the specific question of delivery timelines. Relying heavily on just 2 manufacturers for an entire fleet leaves any airline structurally exposed if either Boeing or Airbus runs into serious production problems, safety groundings, or supply chain disruptions of their own, situations the industry has actually witnessed play out more than once over the past decade. Having a credible third manufacturer genuinely available as an option, even if it only ever fills a modest portion of a given fleet, gives an airline additional negotiating leverage with its existing suppliers and a built-in hedge against exactly this kind of disruption. That strategic logic doesn't automatically make the C919 the right choice for Malaysia Airlines on its own, but it does help explain why serious fleet planners across the industry are paying closer attention to a credible third option than they might have just 5 or 6 years ago, back when Boeing and Airbus still felt like the only realistic choices on the table. There's also a broader question worth considering about what actually happens inside an airline during one of these lengthy evaluation periods. Malaysia Airlines would almost certainly want to see detailed operational data from the aircraft's existing service history inside China, current dispatch reliability rates, maintenance turnaround times, and real fuel burn figures gathered from actual revenue flights, rather than manufacturer projections and marketing. Brochures, they would likely want to understand exactly what parts availability and technical support would realistically look like for an aircraft operating well outside its home market, given how much of the current maintenance infrastructure remains concentrated inside China itself. And crucially, they would need clarity on training pathways for pilots and maintenance crews who have spent their entire careers working with Boeing and Airbus aircraft types, learning to safely and confidently operate a genuinely new type from scratch. None of these questions are unique to the C919 specifically. Every airline works through exactly this kind of due diligence before adding any new aircraft type to its fleet, but they help explain why an evaluation like this one can stretch on for years before any firm commitment is actually made public. There's also a competitive dimension worth thinking about from the perspective of other Southeast Asian carriers watching the situation unfold from the sidelines. Airlines across the region, from Thailand to Indonesia to Vietnam, are all wrestling with the exact same delivery backlog problem currently facing Malaysia Airlines, and all of them are watching this evaluation extremely closely for exactly the reasons we've already covered. If Malaysia Airlines does eventually move forward and the aircraft performs well in real revenue service, it's easy to imagine other regional carriers quietly opening their own evaluations shortly afterward. Not necessarily out of any particular enthusiasm for Chinese aircraft specifically, but simply because nobody wants to be left waiting even longer for Boeing and Airbus deliveries, while a regional rival has already secured additional capacity through an alternative source. That kind of competitive follow-the-leader dynamic has played out before in aviation history whenever a genuinely credible new aircraft option has entered a market, and there's little reason to expect this situation would unfold any differently. There's also a financing dimension quietly sitting underneath all of this that rarely makes it into the headlines. Aircraft purchases of this scale are almost never simple cash transactions. They typically involve complex financing arrangements with banks, export credit agencies, and leasing companies, all of whom need to feel genuinely comfortable with an aircraft's long-term resale value and its ongoing operational track record before extending favorable terms. A brand new aircraft type with limited international operating history, however capable it might be on paper, often comes with less favorable financing terms simply because lenders and lessors haven't yet built up enough. That's precisely the kind of gap that an early, credible international customer like Malaysia Airlines could help close for COMAC, not just through the prestige of the order itself, but by generating the real-world operational data that eventually makes financing this aircraft easier and cheaper for every airline that follows. It's also worth remembering that this wouldn't be the first time a genuinely new aircraft manufacturer has needed exactly this kind of breakthrough moment to establish itself on the world stage. Airbus itself, now treated as an unquestioned equal to Boeing, spent its own early decades fighting for exactly this same kind of credibility, working hard to convince skeptical airlines outside its home European market that its aircraft could be trusted just as much as anything coming out of Seattle. That transformation didn't happen overnight, and it certainly didn't happen through marketing alone. It happened gradually through accumulated flight hours, satisfied early customers, and a slowly building track record that eventually became impossible for the rest of the industry to ignore. Whether COMAC is able to follow anything resembling that same trajectory remains to be seen, but the pattern itself is a familiar one in aviation history, and it's exactly the pattern that a Malaysia Airlines order, if it materializes, would help set in motion. Whatever ultimately happens with this particular evaluation, whether it results in a landmark order or quietly fades away after years of careful deliberation, the underlying story here reflects something much bigger than just one airline's fleet planning decision. It reflects a global aviation industry currently working through genuine capacity constraints, a rapidly growing and increasingly important Asian aviation market hungry for more aircraft, and a new Chinese-built jet actively trying to prove, flight by flight, order by order, that it truly belongs on the same stage as Boeing and Airbus. For an industry that has operated as a comfortable duopoly for decades, even the possibility of a serious new entrant gaining real traction is enough to make everyone from Seattle to Toulouse pay very close attention indeed. If you found this breakdown genuinely interesting, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of the aviation stories still to come.